The year 1879 choked the town of Redemption Gulch in a perpetual cloud of fine, red dust. It was a place baked into existence by an unforgiving sun. A splintered collection of buildings crouched low against a vast, bleached sky. The wind was the town's only true preacher, howling sermons of hardship through the gaps in the rock formations that stood like skeletal sentinels on the horizon. Water was a prayer whispered more often than it was answered, and life was as brittle as the sagebrush that clung stubbornly to the scorched earth. Into this crucible of dust and judgment, the noon stagecoach delivered a bride. Her name was Eloise. She stepped down onto the splintered boardwalk, her hands trembling as she clutched a worn valise. She wore her best dress, a simple calico of faded blue, and a bonnet that dipped low, casting a deep shadow over her face. But a shadow, however deep, could not conceal the landscape of her skin. The entire left side of her face, from her temple down to her jaw, was a tapestry of scars. A fire, long ago in her childhood, had claimed her beauty, leaving behind a puckered, discolored ruin that drew the eye and held it in a grip of morbid fascination. The skin was pulled taut, giving her a permanent, slight grimace, and her left eye, though perfectly fine, seemed to weep in the hollow of its scarred socket. She had come on the promise of a letter. A man named Jedediah Stone, a rancher she'd never met, had sought a wife through a mail-order catalog. Her entry had been honest, describing a woman of good health, skilled in domestic arts, and of a quiet temperament. It had, however, omitted the singular detail that now defined her existence. She had prayed it wouldn't matter to a lonely man in need of a partner. Jedediah was waiting, leaning against a post of the general store. He was a tall, lean man, his face weathered by the sun into a mask of perpetual squinting. When he saw her approach, he straightened up, a flicker of anticipation in his eyes. He took a step forward. "Miss Eloise." "Mr. Stone," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. She forced herself to lift her head, to let the shadow of her bonnet fall away. It was the moment of truth, the precipice she had been dreading for the entire bone-jarring journey. The anticipation in his eyes died instantly, replaced by a cold, flat shock that quickly curdled into revulsion. His gaze fixed on her scars, his lips thinning into a cruel, straight line. He didn't even try to hide it. He took a half-step back, as if she carried a contagion. "No," he said, the single word a whip crack in the tense silence. "That ain't her. That ain't the woman in the letter." Eloise's heart, which had been hammering against her ribs, seemed to stop altogether. "But I am her, sir. I am Eloise. I can cook, and sew, and I'm a hard worker." "I said no." He cut her off, his voice hard as granite. He didn't look at her again. He turned on his heel, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, and strode away without a backward glance, leaving her standing alone on the boardwalk as the stagecoach kicked up a fresh cloud of dust and rumbled out of town. The rejection was a public execution. The silence that followed was heavy with watching eyes. From the saloon, a man snickered. Two women, clutching their shopping baskets outside the mercantile, began whispering behind their hands, their eyes darting between Eloise and the retreating back of Jedediah Stone. A child pointed, his mother quickly yanking his arm down with a sharp hiss. It began then, the murmur that would follow her like a stray dog. The stares, a mixture of raw curiosity, disgust, and a shallow, useless pity that felt worse than outright scorn. Eloise stood frozen, the harsh sun beating down on her bonnet. Humiliation burned hotter than any fire ever had. She had nowhere to go. The few dollars she possessed were barely enough for a room for a night or two, and the return fare was an impossible dream. She was adrift in a sea of dust and hostile faces. For 3 days, she became a ghost. She wandered the single and dusty street of Redemption Gulch, seeking any kind of work. The saloon keeper laughed in her face. The hotelier said he had no need for a cleaner. The blacksmith's wife took one look at her and shut the door. Her money dwindled to a few pennies. Hunger became a dull, constant ache in her belly. She slept one night behind the church, pulling her thin shawl around her shoulders against the surprising chill of the desert night. The mournful howl of a distant coyote, her only lullaby. Her spirit began to fray. The desperate hope that had carried her across the plains was eroding, leaving behind the raw bedrock of fear. The constant whispers were a physical torment, raising the heat in her scarred cheek until it throbbed. She saw her reflection in a shop window, a hunched figure in a faded dress, half a face obscured by shadow, and felt a wave of self-loathing so intense it made her dizzy. The world saw a monster, a creature of pity and revulsion, and in that dusty, unforgiving town, she was beginning to believe it herself. It was on the fourth day, when her last coin was gone and a gnawing despair had taken root in her soul, that she found herself on the outskirts of town. The houses here were sparse, giving way to the vast, empty expanse of the desert. At the very edge, set back from the road, was a small, well-kept homestead. It was a sturdy-looking cabin with a porch, a solid stone chimney, and a corral with 2 horses. A plume of smoke curled from the chimney, a lonely signal of life. As Eloise hesitated by the rickety fence, the cabin door opened and a woman emerged. She was older, perhaps in her 50s, with hair the color of steel pulled back in a severe bun. She moved with a purpose that belied her age, carrying 2 buckets toward a well. She was dressed practically in a man's worn trousers and a simple blouse, her face a roadmap of lines etched by sun and sorrow. Eloise's desperation overrode her fear of another rejection. She pushed open the gate and walked toward the woman, her feet sinking into the soft dirt. The woman stopped cranking the well handle when she saw her. Her eyes, a pale, piercing blue, narrowed. They took in Eloise's worn dress, her valise, and then settled, unflinching, on her face. There was no gasp, no visible recoil, just a steady, assessing gaze that was somehow more unnerving than open disgust. "What do you want?" The woman's voice was low and raspy, like stones grinding together. "Please, ma'am," Eloise began, her voice cracking. "I'm looking for work, any work. I can mend, clean, cook. I'll do anything. I just need a place to stay. A meal." The woman finished drawing the water, her movements economical and strong. "Town's got no work for you," she stated, not unkindly, but as a simple fact. They got no work for anyone they don't like the look of. The bluntness of it, the simple acknowledgement of her plight, almost made Eloise weep. "I know," she whispered, "but I have nowhere else to go." The woman studied her for a long moment. Her gaze was intense, as if she were weighing not just Eloise's words, but the very substance of her soul. She was May, a widow who had lived alone on this patch of land since her husband was killed 5 years prior. The town mostly left her alone, viewing her with a mixture of respect and suspicion. A woman who lived like a man, who carried a rifle as comfortably as a skillet, was an anomaly they didn't know how to categorize. "I don't need no help," May said finally, her voice firm. Eloise's shoulders slumped. Of course, it was the same answer as everywhere else. She turned to leave, the weight of her failure a physical burden. "Wait." The word stopped her. She turned back. May was looking toward the small stable that stood beside the corral. "The stable's warm enough," May said, her tone begrudging. "There's fresh hay. You can sleep there. For tonight. We'll see about tomorrow." Eloise could hardly believe it. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and stinging. "Thank you, ma'am. God bless you. Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," May grunted, lifting the heavy buckets as if they were filled with feathers. "You'll earn your keep, and don't expect conversation." She walked back toward the cabin without another word, leaving Eloise standing by the well. That night, Eloise made a bed for herself in a clean stall, the sweet, earthy smell of hay and horse a strange comfort. She was grateful, so profoundly grateful it ached. But as she lay in the darkness, listening to the horses shifting and snorting softly beside her, the gratitude was mingled with the bitter taste of her own existence. She was a woman who had come to be a bride, and she was sleeping in a barn. The chasm between her dreams and her reality was as vast and empty as the desert sky outside. The desire to be loved, to be seen as more than her scars, was a raw, open wound inside her. But the fear, the cold certainty that she was unworthy of that love, was a poison that seeped into every corner of her being, leaving her to tremble alone in the dark. The arrangement began with a silent rhythm dictated by the sun. Eloise rose before the first hint of light, the chill of the stable air a sharp reminder of her place. Her days were a litany of chores that May never had to assign. They were simply there, etched into the fabric of homestead life. She drew water from the deep. Stubborn well, her soft hands quickly growing calloused and raw from the splintered rope. She fed the half-dozen scrawny chickens, scattering their feed with a gentle murmur, a quiet tenderness that was entirely her own. She scrubbed May's few tin plates and patched the woman's threadbare trousers with neat, almost invisible stitches, her needle moving with a swift, practiced grace. May, in the beginning, was a figure of granite. She worked alongside Eloise, but not with her. There was a wall of silence between them, thick and unbreachable. She would watch, her pale blue eyes missing nothing, the way Eloise didn't flinch when a fence post splintered in her hand, the patience with which she coaxed a stubborn hen back into its coop, the thoroughness of her work. May offered no praise, but she provided sustenance. Each noon, a bowl of thin stew and a slice of hard bread would be left on a stump outside the cabin door. Each evening, the same. It was fuel, not fellowship. Eloise ate her meals on an overturned bucket by the stable, the vast, indifferent landscape her only companion. Yet, slowly, almost imperceptibly, a shift occurred. It wasn't in words, but in small, quiet gestures. One evening, the stew was thicker, with more rabbit than potato. Another day, May left an old pair of leather work gloves beside the bowl, their insides worn smooth by another's hands. Eloise accepted these offerings with a silent, grateful heart, understanding they were the only language the stoic widow knew. May, for her part, began to see past the scarred tissue on the young woman's face. She saw an endurance that matched her own, a quiet refusal to be broken that resonated with the core of her own battered spirit. This girl did not whine or complain. She simply worked, her head bowed, as if labor itself were a form of prayer. The true thaw came on a moonless night, when the wind moaned around the corners of the cabin like a lost soul. Eloise was deep in a dream, a place of smoke and memory where the world was painted in the terrifying orange of fire. She could feel the searing heat, smell the acrid scent of burning wood and hair, and hear the high, thin scream of her younger brother, Samuel. In her sleep, a cry tore from her own throat, a raw, strangled sound of pure terror that cut through the desert silence. The sound jolted May from her cot. Her first instinct was defense. She reached for the rifle she kept by her bed. But then the sound came again. Not a threat from outside, but a broken, weeping sob from the stable, cursing under her breath. She lit a lantern, the small flame pushing back the immense darkness, and walked outside. She found Eloise thrashing in the hay, her hands clutching at her face, her body trembling violently. "No! Samuel, run! Get out!" she sobbed, still trapped in the nightmare. May stood in the stable doorway for a long moment, the lantern light casting long, dancing shadows. Her first impulse was to retreat, to let the girl ride out her own demons. It was not her business, but the sheer agony in Eloise's voice held her fast. She walked over and knelt in the hay. She didn't speak. She didn't try to wake her. Instead, she reached out and took Eloise's flailing hand. Her grip was firm, her palm calloused and strong. She simply held on, a silent, unshakable anchor in the storm of Eloise's memory. Slowly, the thrashing subsided. Eloise's ragged breaths evened out. She surfaced from the dream, disoriented, her cheeks wet with tears. The first thing she felt was the solid, warm pressure of May's hand enveloping hers. Her eyes fluttered open, and she saw the older woman kneeling beside her, her face illuminated by the soft lantern glow, unreadable as stone. But her hand was a comfort so profound it made Eloise's throat ache. They stayed like that for a long time, the silence broken only by the soft shifting of the horses. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Eloise began to speak.
"My father was a blacksmith,"
she said, her gaze fixed on the rough-hewn timbers of the stable roof.
"The forge was my whole world. The smell of coal and hot iron, the sound of the hammer. It was like a heartbeat."
She told May about the day the fire started. A stray spark, a pile of dry kindling. It moved so fast. Her little brother, Samuel, only 6 years old, had been trapped behind a fallen stack of iron bars.
"Everyone was shouting, running away from the heat,"
she whispered, her hand tightening in May's.
"But I could hear him crying. I ran back in. The heat was like a wall. I remember my sleeve catching fire, and then my hair."
She finally looked at May, her one good eye shining with unshed tears.
"I got him out, but the roof beam fell. It shielded him, but
it caught me." The silence that followed was heavier than before. Eloise took a shaky breath.
"There was a young man,"
she continued, her voice hollow.
"William. His father owned the tannery. We were to be married. He was so handsome. He brought me wildflowers."
She paused.
"After the fire, he visited once. In the infirmary. He couldn't look at me. A month later, he married the banker's daughter. I heard she had a dowry of 2 fine horses."
May didn't respond, but her thumb moved in a slow, comforting circle over the back of Eloise's hand. After another long pause, it was May who broke the silence, her own voice raspy with disuse. "My husband's name was Arthur," she said, looking out into the darkness. "He was a good man, too good for this place. He saw things in black and white, right and wrong, no gray." She told Eloise about the rustlers who had been stealing from the smaller homesteads, protected by a sheriff who was either bought or a coward. Arthur spoke up, at a town meeting, called them out by name. He told the men they had to stand together, or they'd lose everything. They all just stared at their boots. Her voice became flat, devoid of emotion. 3 nights later, they came for him, ambushed him on the road back from the river, shot him in the back. The sheriff called it a hunting accident. She fell silent, but Eloise could feel a tremor in the strong hand that held hers. "When I went to town to demand justice, they called me hysterical, a shrew. When I didn't sell up and run, when I learned to shoot straight and fix my own fences, they started calling me the defiant widow, like it was a disease." In the flickering lantern light, 2 scarred souls saw each other for the first time. They were women forged in different fires, but their burns were the same. They had both been punished by the world, one for her appearance, the other for her spirit. From that night on, things changed. Eloise was moved from the stable into a small cot in the corner of the cabin. They started taking their meals together at the small, rough-hewn table. The silence between them was no longer a wall, but a comfortable space. They worked together, falling into an easy rhythm, mending fences and tending to the small vegetable patch behind the cabin. Sometimes, while working, a quiet smile would pass between them. One afternoon, when a chicken escaped and led them on a frantic chase through the sagebrush, they both collapsed against the corral fence, breathless, and a sound filled the air that the homestead hadn't heard in 5 years. Laughter. It was rusty and quiet at first. Then it grew. A shared, liberating sound that seemed to chase some of the shadows away. One evening, as Eloise was mending one of her own dresses, May watched the nimble work of her fingers. Later that week, with their flour supplies running low, Eloise baked bread, the cabin filled with a warm, yeasty aroma that spoke of home and comfort. The bread was light, with a perfectly crisp crust. May,
who had lived on hardtack and jerky for years, ate 3 pieces without a word. The next day, she saw Eloise using the last of their sugar and some hoarded dried apples to bake a small pie. It was a perfect creation, the crust flaky and golden. As May watched Eloise's scarred face soften with concentration, an idea, sharp and clear as a shard of glass, formed in her mind. "You have a gift, girl," May said, her voice startlingly direct. Eloise looked up, flustered. "It's just a pie. May—" "No," May said, tapping a finger on the table. "It's survival. You're sewing. This baking. It's better than anything in that dusty town." She looked at Eloise, her pale eyes intense. "There's a market day at the end of the month. We're going to sell these. We're going to earn our own way." For the first time since she had arrived in Redemption Gulch, Eloise felt a flicker not just of hope, but of possibility. She was no longer a charity case sleeping in a barn. She was a woman with a skill, a partner. And as she looked across the table at the hard, determined face of the defiant widow, she realized she was no longer entirely alone. Market day in Redemption Gulch was a chaotic symphony of noise and smells. The usual blanket of red dust was stirred into a frenzy by the influx of ranchers, miners, and homesteaders who came to trade, gossip, and escape the crushing monotony of their isolated lives. The air hung thick with the scent of horse manure, cheap whiskey, and frying bacon. Against this boisterous backdrop, May and Eloise's small stall was an island of quiet industry. They had set up a simple plank table near the end of the main street, laying out a dozen small apple pies and several loaves of freshly baked bread on a clean linen cloth. The warm, sweet scent of cinnamon and baked goods was a stark contrast to the town's usual aroma, and it drew curious glances. Eloise, wearing her bonnet low, kept her eyes fixed on her hands, her heart a nervous flutter in her chest. Each person who slowed to look felt like a judge, but May stood beside the table, straight and unyielding, her arms crossed over her chest. Her presence was a fortress, and Eloise drew strength from it. They sold 2 loaves of bread in the first hour, the clink of the coins in their small tin box a thrilling sound. It was mid-morning when a shadow fell across their table. Eloise looked up and her blood ran cold. It was one of the cowboys from the saloon, one of the men who had laughed the loudest on the day she arrived. His name was Caleb, a man whose swagger was as loud as his silver-roweled spurs. He was handsome in a rough, careless way, with a sly grin that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Well now, what have we here?" he drawled, tipping his hat back. He ignored May completely, his eyes locking onto Eloise. "Didn't take you for a baker, little lady." Eloise flinched at the memory his voice conjured, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "The pies are 10 cents, sir. The bread is 5. Caleb chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. He leaned in, feigning an interest in the pies, his proximity forcing Eloise to breathe in the stale scent of tobacco and sweat. "They sure do smell fine, almost as fine as you." His words were coated in a thick layer of false charm. "A woman with skills like these, a shame you're hiding out here with this old crow." He flicked a dismissive glance at May. May's expression didn't change, but her posture stiffened. "State your business or move along," she said, her voice flat. Caleb just grinned wider, his attention returning to Eloise. "I'll take one of them pies," he said, placing a coin on the table. "But a man gets thirsty. Tell you what, there's a water pump round back of the mercantile. Why don't you show me where it is? And we can talk a bit? It ain't right for a woman like you to be so solitary." It was a test, a public display. If she refused, he would mock her. If she accepted, she would be walking into a trap she could feel being set. But the hopeful part of her, the small, stupid part that still yearned for a kind word from a man, whispered that maybe she was wrong. Maybe he was just being friendly. Hesitantly, she looked to May. May gave a barely perceptible shake of her head, a warning clear as a gunshot. But Caleb pressed. "Aw, don't mind her," he said smoothly, gesturing toward May. "She's just sour on the world. Come on, just a walk to the pump." Feeling the weight of a dozen watching eyes, Eloise made a disastrous decision. She nodded weakly. "All right." She followed him away from the relative safety of the stall, her every step a betrayal of May's silent warning. He led her not directly to the pump, but into the narrow, refuse-strewn alley that ran between the mercantile and the assay office. The sounds of the market faded, replaced by the buzzing of flies and the oppressive silence of the enclosed space. He stopped and turned, his charming smile gone, replaced by a predatory leer. "You know," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "a man gets lonely out here, and a woman like you must get awful lonely too." He took a step closer, crowding her against the rough wooden wall. "Fact is, a woman with a face like that, you can't be too particular, but I'm a generous man. I'd be willing to keep you company. For a price, of course." He reached out and brushed his thumb against her unscarred cheek, his touch slimy and offensive. Ice flooded Eloise's veins. This was it. This was the raw, ugly truth behind every stare and whisper. She was not a person to them. She was a damaged thing, an object of morbid curiosity or base appetite, to be used and discarded. She tried to pull away, but he grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "Don't be shy now," he sneered. "You should be grateful." "Let go of me," she whispered, her voice choked with panic. "Or what?" he challenged, his face close to hers. "Or you'll be pulling a trigger with your left hand for the rest of your life." The voice was cold steel. It came from the mouth of the alley. May stood there, a vision of righteous fury. In her hand, she held an old Colt peacemaker, and it was pointed squarely at Caleb's chest. The barrel didn't waver. Caleb froze, his eyes widening in shock and fear. He dropped Eloise's arm as if it were a hot coal. "Now hold on, May," he stammered, raising his hands. "We was just talking." "Your talking is done," May said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Get out of my sight, and if you ever look at her again, if you ever so much as breathe in her direction, I will give you a scar that'll make hers look like a scratch." Caleb, pale and sweating, scrambled backward and fled the alley, disappearing into the market day crowd. The moment he was gone, the strength that had held Eloise upright dissolved. A great shuddering sob escaped her, and her legs gave way. May was there in an instant, holstering the pistol and catching her before she hit the ground. She wrapped a steadying arm around Eloise's shoulders and led her away, leaving their table, their pies, and their earnings behind. The walk home was a blur of shame and misery for Eloise. Back in the cabin, the door shut against the world. Her control shattered completely. She collapsed onto her cot, the sobs tearing from her body in violent, agonizing waves. It was the culmination of every rejection, every cruel glance, every lonely night. "I can't," she gasped, the words ripped from her soul. "I cannot live like this. May, to be looked at like I am less than human. I can't bear it. I can't bear it if I'm never to be loved." May let her cry. She sat in her chair, silent, letting the storm of grief run its course. She knew that this was a pain that couldn't be soothed with empty platitudes. Only when the sobs had subsided to quiet, hiccuping breaths, did she speak, her voice rough but gentle. "Love ain't something people give you, child," she said, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames in the hearth. "It's not a prize you win for being pretty or lucky. Love, it's something you grow inside yourself, a garden you tend to, even when the soil is rock hard and there ain't no rain. You grow it for you, and if you're lucky, someone comes along who's worthy of walking through it." Her words hung in the quiet cabin, simple and profound. They didn't fix the hurt, but they planted a different kind of seed in Eloise's ravaged heart. In the days that followed, the air in the cabin changed.
The quiet companionship deepened into something more fragile and intense. They sat together in the evenings long after the chores were done. The silence between them no longer empty, but filled with unspoken thoughts. Eloise would watch May's strong, capable hands mending a piece of harness, and a strange warmth would spread through her chest. May would find her gaze lingering on the curve of Eloise's neck as she bent over a book, or the way the firelight softened the edges of her scars. Their eyes would meet across the table, and, for a heartbeat too long, the world would fall away, leaving just the two of them in the flickering light. A dangerous, thrilling, and terrifying awareness began to dawn. Then the storm came. It rolled in from the plains without warning, a furious onslaught of wind and rain that lashed against the small cabin. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the very timbers of the house. In the middle of the night, a steady drip, drip, drip began. A leak in the old roof, directly over Eloise's cot. Within minutes, her blankets were soaked. "It's no good," May said over the roar of the wind. "You'll catch your death. We'll have to sleep by the fire." Together, they gathered the driest blankets and quilts, making a shared pallet on the floor before the hearth. The space was small, intimate. They lay down side by side, not touching, the fire casting their shadows long and trembling against the wall. The storm was a wild thing outside, but inside, the tension was a quiet, suffocating storm of its own. Eloise began to shiver. It was partly the damp chill in the air, but it was also a deep, internal tremor, a reaction to the day's horror and the confusing, powerful emotions that now swirled within her. "May?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm here." Would you? She faltered, shame and need warring within her. "Could you just hold me for a moment, so I stop shaking?" The request hung in the air between them, fragile and momentous. For a long moment, May didn't move. Eloise thought she would be refused. Then, slowly, deliberately, May shifted and wrapped an arm around her. It was not a passionate embrace, but something far more elemental. It was shelter. Eloise turned and pressed her face into May's shoulder, inhaling the scent of wood smoke, rain, and the clean, honest scent of May herself. She felt the steady, strong beat of the older woman's heart against her ear. The shivering subsided, replaced by a profound, aching sense of peace. It felt like coming home. The silence was absolute, charged with a silent, desperate wanting. It was a slow, sacred moment, but tangled within it was a lifetime of shame. Suddenly, as if touching a hot stove, May pulled back. The connection was broken. She shifted away, putting a few inches of space between them. Her back now partially turned to Eloise. The rejection was as sharp and sudden as a physical blow. For the rest of the night, they lay in silence, a chasm of confusion and fear having opened between them. For the next several days, May was distant, the wall between them rebuilt higher and colder than ever. She avoided Eloise's eyes, but something had irrevocably broken. They had both felt it in that brief, trembling embrace, a fragile, terrifying hope. And now they were both lost in the wilderness of their own hearts, consumed by a longing they didn't dare name and a fear of what it might mean. The silence in the cabin grew into a living thing. It sat between them at the table, heavy and suffocating. It followed them through their chores, a constant, unspoken accusation. Eloise would feel May's eyes on her and flinch. The memory of that brief, warm embrace and the subsequent cold withdrawal, a fresh wound. She felt a profound and terrible shame, a conviction that she had taken May's kindness and twisted it into something grotesque and unnatural. The feelings that had been stirring within her, a deep, comforting warmth that blossomed whenever May was near, now seemed like a sickness, another scar on her already ruined soul. She was a woman. She was meant to be a bride for a man. This strange, tender yearning for another woman was surely a mark of her own depravity, a sin whispered in the dark corners of her heart.
May, too, was locked in her own prison of guilt. The image of Eloise's trembling form in her arms haunted her. The girl had come to her starving and rejected. A lost bird with a broken wing. And what had she done? In a moment of weakness, she had offered a comfort that felt dangerously close to desire. She saw herself as a predator, taking advantage of a young woman's desperation and loneliness. Arthur's face swam in her memory, his honest eyes seeming to judge her. She was a widow, meant to be honorable and solitary. This feeling for Eloise felt like a betrayal of her past, a selfish indulgence that preyed upon the vulnerability of the one person she had sworn, in her own quiet way, to protect. And so she retreated behind her wall of granite, her words becoming clipped and functional, her movements brusque, hoping the coldness would cauterize the strange, new feeling before it could take root. The tension stretched for nearly a week, thin and taut, until it finally snapped. It happened on a quiet evening, the setting sun painting the cabin in strokes of orange and purple. Eloise was trying to mend a tear in her dress, but her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't guide the needle. She pricked her finger for the third time, and a single drop of blood welled up, dark against her pale skin. It was the final, tiny wound that broke her. The needle slipped from her fingers. A quiet, hopeless sound escaped her lips. May, who had been cleaning a rifle by the hearth, looked up, her expression guarded. Eloise finally raised her head, her face a mask of quiet despair, tears tracking silently through the dust on her cheeks. Her voice, when she spoke, was a ragged whisper, the culmination of a lifetime of pain. "If I'm not beautiful," she began, her gaze locking with May's, pleading for an answer to a question she had never dared to ask. "If I cannot be a bride, if I am not wanted by any man." Her breath hitched, the words catching in her throat. "Am I allowed to be loved?" The question struck May with the force of a physical blow. It was not about their awkward embrace in the storm. It was about everything. About a world that had told this girl she was worthless because of a fire she had bravely survived. It stripped away all of May's guilt and fear, laying bare the raw, brutal injustice of Eloise's life. Words were useless. They were stones in her throat. Slowly, May put the rifle aside. She walked across the small cabin and knelt before Eloise's cot. She didn't speak. She simply reached out a calloused, gentle hand and, with her thumb, wiped a tear from Eloise's unscarred cheek. It was an absolution, an answer, an acknowledgement of a pain so deep it had no name. Eloise leaned into the touch, a great, shuddering sigh passing through her. And for a long moment, they stayed like that. Two solitary figures finding a fragile peace in a world that had offered them none. The next morning, May seemed to have made a decision. "The wild thyme will be blooming on the high ridge," she announced, her voice even. "We're low on herbs. We'll ride out." The journey was a release. They rode the two steady horses up out of the dusty basin and into the foothills, where the air grew thin and clean, scented with pine and dry earth. The sky here was a vast, aching blue, and the wind was a constant, cleansing presence, whistling through the canyons and whipping at their hair. They were dwarfed by the landscape of towering rock formations, gnarled junipers, and sweeping valleys. In the face of such ancient, wild indifference, their own silent turmoil seemed to shrink, becoming less monstrous. They worked for hours, filling their sacks with thyme, sage, and wild mint. The physical labor was a balm, and for the first time in days, they fell back into their easy, silent rhythm. They shared a piece of bread and a canteen of water, sitting on a sun-warmed slab of rock that overlooked the entire world. It was on the way back, navigating a steep, shale-covered path, that it happened. The horse Eloise was leading stumbled, and in trying to steady it, her own worn-out boots slipped on the loose rock. She cried out, a small, startled sound, as her ankle twisted beneath her and she went down hard. A sharp, searing pain shot up her leg. May was off her horse in an instant, her face a mask of concern. Are you hurt?" Eloise tried to stand, but a wave of dizziness and a fresh spike of pain forced her back down with a grimace. "My ankle. I think I've twisted it." May examined it with practiced hands, her touch firm but gentle. "It's swelling," she said, her voice tight. "You can't walk on it." Without another word, May straightened up. Before Eloise could protest, the older woman had bent down, sliding one strong arm under her knees and the other around her back, and lifted her. Eloise gasped. She was shockingly light in May's arms. The world tilted, a dizzying panorama of rock and sky, and then settled. All she could see was May's face, etched with concentration and a fierce, protective tenderness. The sun was low in the sky, casting a golden light around them, and in that moment, suspended between the earth and the sky, their eyes met. Everything fell away. The pain in her ankle, the horses, the vast landscape. It all disappeared. There was only the universe in May's pale blue eyes. No words were spoken. None were needed. A silent understanding passed between them, a truth so powerful and profound it left them both breathless. May held her for a long, silent moment, her heart hammering against Eloise's side, before carefully placing her on the back of her own steady mare and leading them slowly home. That night, the cabin was filled with a new kind of silence. It was not the silence of tension or fear, but of reverence, of anticipation. May had tended to Eloise's ankle, wrapping it tightly. They ate their dinner in near darkness, the fire in the hearth having burned down to glowing embers. Afterward, Eloise lay on her cot, watching May sit in her chair, staring into the dying fire. The memory of being held in her arms, of that look in her eyes, was a burning ember inside her. The fear was still there, a whisper of wrongness in the back of her mind, but it was drowned out by a longing so powerful it was a physical ache. Slowly, hesitantly, Eloise reached out her hand. It was a simple gesture, a silent question. May saw the movement from the corner of her eye. She turned her head, her expression unreadable in the deep shadows. She looked at the outstretched hand, then at Eloise's face, her eyes wide and vulnerable in the gloom. For a long, agonizing moment, she did nothing. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement that seemed to cost her everything, she rose from her chair, crossed the small space between them, and knelt by the cot. She did not take Eloise's hand. Instead, she gently lifted her own and, with trembling fingers, traced the landscape of scars on Eloise's face. Her touch was feather-light, hesitant. It was not a touch of pity or curiosity. It was a touch of wonder, of discovery. She traced the puckered skin along her jaw, the taut line of her temple, as if she were reading a sacred text written in a language only she could understand. A single tear escaped Eloise's eye and rolled down her cheek. May's thumb brushed it away. Eloise's breath hitched, a soft, sharp sound in the stillness. She leaned into the touch, her own hand coming up to rest on May's wrist, feeling the strong, steady pulse beneath the weathered skin. The air grew thick, charged with the years of unspoken loneliness. May's gaze dropped to Eloise's lips. The world narrowed to the few inches between them. It was a slow, inevitable closing of a distance that had felt miles wide only hours before. The movement was full of doubt, of hesitation, but beneath it was a current of undeniable, magnetic force. It was intense. It was real. It was a prayer whispered in the dark. Afterward, there was only the sound of their breathing and the soft sigh of the embers in the hearth. They lay in the darkness, not speaking, not touching, each adrift in the enormity of what had just happened. A threshold had been crossed. There was no going back, but in the vast, uncertain silence that followed, neither of them knew if they had just made a terrible, damning mistake, or if they had finally, miraculously, touched something holy. The quiet sanctity of the cabin could not hold back the world forever. A town like Redemption Gulch thrives on whispers, And a secret is like a loose stone that, once dislodged, starts an avalanche. It began with a single observation. A miner, heading out to his claim before dawn, saw a figure emerge from May's cabin. It was the scarred girl. He saw her walk the short distance to the stable, her silhouette stark against the pale, pre-dawn sky. That was all it took. The observation was shared over morning coffee at the Mercantile. By noon, it had been embellished over whiskey at the saloon. By evening, it was a fully formed, ugly certainty, whispered over dinner tables throughout the town. The defiant widow and the ruined bride. It was unnatural. It was unholy. The town, which had tolerated May's solitude and pitied Eloise's disfigurement, now had a new lens through which to view them, suspicion and disgust. The change was palpable. When May and Eloise next went to the market, the whispers were no longer behind cupped hands, but spoken just loudly enough to be heard. The stares were no longer just curious, they were sharp with accusation. A woman pulled her child away as they passed. The blacksmith, a man who had once offered May a grudging respect, now looked straight through her. The animosity found its focus at their small stall. People who had previously bought their bread now walked past, their faces averted. Those who did stop came not to buy, but to gawk. The cruelty reached its apex when Caleb, the cowboy May had threatened, swaggered up with two of his friends. He didn't speak to them. He simply stood there, a malicious grin on his face, and looked from Eloise to May and back again. "What you selling here, ladies?" one of his friends asked, his voice dripping with insinuation. "Something sweet?" Caleb laughed. Then, with a sudden, vicious movement, he kicked the leg of their simple table. It collapsed, sending the carefully arranged pies and loaves of bread tumbling into the thick, red dust. The three men roared with laughter as Caleb ground a perfect apple pie into the dirt with the heel of his boot, the sweet filling mixing with the filth. "Looks like your goods are spoiled," Caleb sneered, before turning and walking away, leaving them with their ruined work and the sound of laughter from the onlookers. This time, Eloise did not cry. A cold, hard fury rose within her, so intense it burned away the tears. She looked at the smashed pies, at the loaves of bread covered in dirt, and it felt as if she herself were being ground into the dust. This was her fault. She had brought this humiliation, this ruin, upon the one person who had shown her kindness. She said nothing on the walk home. She said nothing as they cleaned up the mess. But that evening, as she packed her few belongings back into her worn valise, the silence was finally broken. "What do you think you're doing?" May asked, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm leaving," Eloise said, not looking at her. "I won't bring this on you. May, they hate me. Because of me. Now they hate you too. I'll walk until I can't walk anymore." "And then what?" May challenged. "You'll die in the desert. You think running is the answer? We run now. Eloise. And we'll be running for the rest of our lives. They'll have won." "They've already won," Eloise cried, whirling to face her, her face a torrent of anger and pain. "Don't you see? There is no place for us. Not here. Not anywhere." "Then we make a place," May said, her voice steely. "I've been run off once in my life, when they killed Arthur and I let them scare me into silence. I'll be damned if I let them do it again." She walked over and placed her hands on Eloise's shoulders. "We are not the unnatural ones. Child, their hatred is the unnatural thing. We will not hide from it." "What can we do?" Eloise whispered, her anger deflating into despair. "This Sunday," May said, her eyes glinting with a defiant fire, "we are going to church." The walk into town that Sunday morning felt like walking to the gallows. The bell of the small white church was tolling, a sound that was meant to be welcoming but now felt like a summons to judgment. Eloise's hands were slick with sweat. As they reached the church steps, May paused. She looked at Eloise, her face calm and resolute, and then she did something unthinkable. She reached down and took Eloise's hand. She laced their fingers together, her grip firm and warm. It was a simple, profound declaration. They walked up the steps and through the open doors, hand in hand. A sudden, shocked silence fell over the congregation. Every head turned. The whispers were like the hissing of snakes. They had almost reached a pew when the preacher, Reverend Miller, a stern man with a face like a clenched fist, moved to block their path. "This is a house of God," he said, his voice booming in the silent church. He did not look at them, but at a point somewhere above their heads. "We've come to worship, Reverend," May said, her voice steady. "Your behavior is an affront to this congregation and an abomination in the eyes of the Lord," the preacher declared. His eyes finally dropped to their joined hands, his lip curling in disgust. "This is not a place for your kind. Leave." The word leave echoed in the rafters. It was a final, public excommunication. The faces of the townspeople were a sea of righteous condemnation, humiliation, hot and sharp, washed over Eloise. But May did not flinch. She held her head high, squeezed Eloise's hand, and turned. Without a word, she led them back out of the church, their joined hands a silent testament to the very thing for which they had just been condemned. They didn't go home. May led Eloise through a small iron gate at the side of the church, into the town cemetery. It was a quiet, lonely place, the weathered headstones tilting in the tall, dry grass. She led her to a simple stone marker under a solitary, wind-swept juniper tree. "Arthur Cole, a good man," it read. They sat on the ground beside the grave, the silence of the cemetery a balm after the venom of the church. The wind sighed through the juniper, a mournful, ancient sound. They sat for a long time, their hands still clasped between them. Finally, Eloise spoke, her voice soft but clear in the quiet air. She looked at the name on the stone, and then at May. "If I were to die soon," she said, her gaze unwavering, "I would want to be buried here, near you." The words were a vow, a commitment far deeper than any that could be made in the church that had just cast them out. It was an acceptance of a life together, and an end together. It was everything. A tear traced a path down May's weathered cheek. She turned to Eloise, her face full of a love that was as fierce and enduring as the landscape around them. She leaned in, and their lips met. It was not like the first time, not hesitant or questioning. This kiss was sure, and deep, and full of a sad, defiant acceptance. It was a seal on their bond, a promise made among the quiet dead, under the vast and indifferent sky. They had chosen each other, and that was all that mattered. As they drew apart, a flicker of movement at the edge of the cemetery caught May's eye. Standing by the far fence, partially obscured by a stand of withered sunflowers, was a figure. It was Caleb. He wasn't moving, just watching. He made no gesture, said no word, but even from that distance, May could see the look on his face. It was not one of simple anger or mockery. It was a cold, reptilian stare, full of a patient, simmering malice. He had seen them, and in his eyes was the promise of a reckoning far more terrible than mere words could ever be. The malice that had been a shadow in Caleb's eyes did not wait long to take physical form. For 3 nights after the confrontation at the cemetery, an uneasy quiet settled over the homestead. But it was a coiled silence, the tense stillness before a storm. May took to sleeping with the colt on the small table beside her cot, and Eloise found herself starting at every skittering sound in the brush, every mournful cry of a distant coyote. The attack came on the 4th night, under the sliver of a dead moon. The darkness was absolute, a thick, black velvet that swallowed the landscape. Eloise was woken not by a sound, but by a smell, acrid and sharp, the scent of kerosene. It was a smell she knew from the deepest, most terrified corner of her memory. At the same time, a frantic, High-pitched whinny tore through the night from the stable. "May!" Eloise cried, scrambling from her cot. But May was already moving. Grabbing the rifle and a lantern, they burst from the cabin door into a scene from Eloise's worst nightmares. The stable was on fire. Not just burning, but engulfed. Flames, a furious, hungry orange, licked up the dry timber walls, roaring into the night sky. The heat was a physical blow, and silhouetted against the inferno for a fleeting second were 3 figures, their laughter carrying on the wind as they fled into the darkness. The horses were screaming now, a terrifying sound of pure animal panic. "The horses!" Eloise screamed, her mind a maelstrom of past and present horrors. "It's too late! Girl, stay back!" May yelled, her face a grim mask in the flickering firelight. She was trying to get a clear shot, to fire a warning, but the men were already gone, swallowed by the night. But Eloise wasn't listening. The sound of trapped, terrified creatures, the smell of burning wood. It was the blacksmith's forge all over again. Her body moved before her mind could protest. This fire would not win. It had taken her face. It would not take their home, their life. It would not take the last thing of value they had. "No!" she screamed and ran. She sprinted toward the blazing stable, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The heat was immense, a solid wall that seemed to push her back. Smoke billowed out, thick and choking, stinging her eyes and clawing at her lungs. She ripped a piece of her nightgown and tied it over her nose and mouth, plunging into the inferno. Inside was chaos. The air was a thicker, blinding soup of smoke and flying embers. The roar of the fire was deafening. The 2 horses, their eyes wide with terror, crashed against the walls of their stalls. The main gate was barred from the outside. The only way out was to unlatch their individual stall doors. She stumbled toward the nearest stall, the one holding May's steady mare. Daisy. The wooden door was hot to the touch. The simple iron latch, however, was glowing a dull, angry red. There was no time to find a cloth, no time for thought. With a desperate cry that was half prayer, half sob, she wrapped her left hand around the searing metal and pulled. The pain was instantaneous and absolute. It was a white-hot electric shock that shot up her entire arm. The smell of her own burning flesh filled her nostrils. She screamed, but the sound was lost in the roar of the fire. The latch gave way. She kicked the door open, slapping the terrified horse on its flank, driving it out of the stall and toward the wider stable opening, praying it would find its way through the smoke. One horse was free. She turned toward the second stall, her left hand a useless, throbbing agony. She could feel the skin blistering, peeling away. The world was beginning to tilt, the edges of her vision turning dark and fuzzy. A heavy, burning timber crashed down from the loft, landing just feet from her, showering her with sparks. The roof was giving way. She took one stumbling step toward the second horse, her vision blurring, her lungs screaming for air. And then the world dissolved into a roaring, suffocating darkness. May, frantic with terror, saw the first horse burst from the smoking mouth of the stable, its coat singed, its eyes wild. But Eloise did not follow. "Eloise!" May screamed, a sound of pure, primal fear. Dropping the rifle, she ran toward the burning structure herself, heedless of the danger. Just as she reached the entrance, the main section of the roof collapsed inward with a deafening crash, sending a fountain of sparks and embers into the sky. A moment later, a figure staggered out of the smoke, choking and soot-covered. It was Eloise. She took 3 steps, her left arm clutched to her chest, her face a pale smudge of shock, and then crumpled to the ground. May fell to her knees beside her, her heart seizing with a terror far colder than any she had ever known. Eloise was unconscious, her breathing shallow and ragged. May gently took her left arm. In the hellish light of the burning stable, she saw the hand. The palm was a raw, weeping mass of burned flesh, the skin blackened and split. A wave of utter despair washed over May. They had taken everything. They had burned her home, and now they had taken her girl. A guttural roar of pure rage tore from her throat. She snatched up the rifle, aimed it at the black, empty sky where the cowards had fled, and fired. Once, twice, 3 times. The gunshots a futile, angry punctuation to her grief. Then the rage was gone, replaced by a desperate, laser-focused purpose. She gently scooped Eloise into her arms, marveling at how light she felt, and carried her to the remaining horse, which had stopped its panicked flight and was now watching the fire with trembling unease. With a strength born of adrenaline and terror, she mounted the horse and pulled Eloise up in front of her, cradling her limp body against her own. She spurred the horse into a gallop, heading for the faint, distant lights of town, leaving the funeral pyre of her life to burn itself out against the night sky. The town doctor, a weary, whiskey-sodden man named Elias Croft, worked by the light of a single kerosene lamp. He cleaned the wound as best he could, his face grim. "It's a bad one. May," he said, shaking his head. "3rd degree. She'll be lucky if she doesn't lose the hand. And the smoke. Her lungs are in a bad way. She has a high fever." He slathered the burn in a foul-smelling salve and wrapped it in clean linen bandages. Sheriff Brody arrived as the doctor was finishing. He was a portly man whose authority seemed to rest entirely on the tin star pinned to his vest. He listened to May's terse, clipped account of the attack, his expression impassive. "You see who did it?" he asked, chewing on a toothpick. "I saw them running," May bit out, her voice trembling with suppressed fury. "It was Caleb and his boys. I heard them laughing." The sheriff sighed, removing the toothpick. "Now, May, a laugh in the dark ain't proof. Lots of folks sound the same. Could have been anyone. Drifters, maybe." "It was them," May insisted, her voice rising. "This happened because of what you people, what your whole damn town has done to us. He threatened us. I told you." "All I know is you and this girl have been stirring up trouble since she arrived," the sheriff said, his tone turning cold. "Maybe if you two lived a more respectable life, you wouldn't attract this kind of unfortunate attention. There's nothing I can do, no proof." He turned and walked out, leaving May standing in the sterile, lamp-lit room, a cold, hard knot of hatred and helplessness in her stomach. She paid the doctor with one of her last silver dollars and sat by Eloise's bedside. They were in a small, clean room at the back of the doctor's office. For 3 days and 3 nights, May did not leave. She sat in a hard-backed wooden chair, watching, waiting, praying to a God she hadn't spoken to in years. Eloise was lost in a fevered delirium. She tossed and turned, her brow beaded with sweat, muttering words that made no sense. She spoke of fire and smoke, of a brother named Samuel, but through it all, one name was a constant, desperate refrain, whispered over and over like a prayer. "May, May, where's May?" May would lean in, sponging her face with a cool, damp cloth. "I'm here, child," she would murmur, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." In those long, quiet hours, as the town outside slept and judged, May's world contracted to the space of that small room. All of her defenses, all the walls she had built around her heart for years, crumbled to dust. The fierce independence, the defiant solitude, it all seemed like a fool's errand. Her life before Eloise had been a grayscale existence, a long, quiet, waiting for the end. Eloise had brought color and warmth and a terrifying, brilliant light into her world. And now, the thought of that light being extinguished was a pain more profound than the grief she had felt for her husband. This was not duty. This was not pity. As she held a cup of water to Eloise's parched lips, as she smoothed the hair back from her feverish brow, she knew, with a certainty that shook her to her very soul, what this feeling was. It was a love so fierce and protective, so absolute, that it eclipsed everything else. It was the only truth left in a world of lies and hatred. On the morning of the fourth day, the fever broke. Eloise's restless thrashing ceased, and she fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. May, exhausted to the bone, finally allowed herself to doze off in the chair, her hand resting on the edge of Eloise's bed. She woke to the feeling of a faint pressure on her fingers. She opened her eyes. Eloise was awake. Her good eye was open, clear and lucid, and fixed on May's face. Her lips were cracked and pale. She tried to speak, her voice a dry, hoarse whisper. "You're still here?" The question was so simple, so elemental. It held all of Eloise's deepest fears, of abandonment, of being unworthy, of being left behind. It was the question of a soul that had never been able to count on anyone. And it broke May completely. All the anger at Caleb, all the frustration with the town, all the terror of the last few days dissolved in a sudden, overwhelming wave of pure, unadulterated love. A great shuddering sob escaped her. The tears she had refused to shed for years, not for her husband, not for her lonely life, not for the hatred of the town, finally came. They streamed down her weathered face, hot and cleansing. She wasn't crying for what they had lost, or for the injustice of it all. She was crying because the girl who had been burned by fire had reached through the flames to save her, and because in a world that had given them nothing, they still had each other. The news of the fire and Eloise's injury spread through Redemption Gulch like a contagion. The official story, parroted by Sheriff Brody and his ilk, was that it was likely drifters, a random act of senseless violence. But beneath that thin veneer, another narrative took root, a story whispered in kitchens and over laundry lines. People had seen Caleb and his friends, drunk and belligerent. That evening, they knew of the confrontation at the market, the expulsion from the church. They knew the truth, even if they were too afraid to speak it aloud. For a week, May and Eloise remained in the small room at the back of the doctor's office, a sanctuary from the town's prying eyes. Eloise's strength returned slowly. The fever was gone, but a deep, bone-weary exhaustion remained, and her bandaged hand was a constant, throbbing reminder of the attack. May tended to her with a devotion that was absolute. The wall between them was gone, replaced by an easy, profound intimacy. They spoke little, but their silence was full of a shared understanding, a lingering look, a gentle touch on a shoulder. The simple act of sharing a meal, these became their language, a vocabulary of love built in the ashes of their old life. One afternoon, there was a soft, hesitant knock on the door. May, expecting the doctor, opened it to find 3 women standing on the threshold, their faces a mixture of nervousness and resolve. It was the blacksmith's wife, a thin, tired-looking woman who ran the town's laundry, and the young wife of a miner. They clutched baskets in their hands. We heard about what happened," the blacksmith's wife stammered, her eyes darting past May to where Eloise lay on the cot. She wouldn't meet May's gaze. "We brought some things." She pushed a basket forward. Inside was a fresh loaf of bread, still warm, a jar of rich beef broth, and a small pot of healing comfrey salve. The other women offered their own meager gifts, a few carefully saved eggs, a bundle of dried chamomile for tea. It was not charity. It was an offering, an apology from the silent majority. I'm sorry," the blacksmith's wife mumbled, finally looking at May. Before, at the store. I was wrong." May, who had been ready with a harsh word to send them away, was struck dumb. She simply nodded, taking the baskets. The women gave Eloise a final, sympathetic look and then scurried away, as if afraid of being seen. They had just closed the door when another figure appeared in the hallway. It was Agnes, a widow in her late 70s who lived alone in a small shack and was considered by most of the town to be half mad. Her face was a fine web of wrinkles, but her eyes were sharp and clear. She had waited for the others to leave. She walked straight into the room and looked from May to Eloise. her gaze missing nothing. "Don't you pay no mind to the fools in this town?" she said, her voice a dry, reedy rasp. "Cowards, the lot of them. Always been." She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, tightly wrapped cloth. "Willow bark," she said, placing it on the bedside table. "For the pain, better than the poison Croft will sell you." She looked at their two faces, at the unspoken bond that now radiated between them. A slow, knowing smile touched her lips. "Not everyone hates you," she said, her voice softening. "This town, it's afraid of anything it don't understand, and it don't understand a love that ain't sanctioned by a preacher in a dusty book." She patted May's arm, her touch surprisingly firm. "Some of us understand. Some of us have lived long enough to know that love is just love. It's a stubborn weed, grows where it can, not just where it's told." With that, she turned and shuffled out, leaving a profound silence in her wake. Agnes was right. The town had fractured. The fire had forced people to choose a side. Caleb and his friends swaggered through the saloon, emboldened by the sheriff's inaction, their whispers growing louder, cruder. But a countercurrent had begun to flow. When May finally took Eloise home, to the shell of a homestead where the smell of smoke still clung to everything, they found a sack of flour and a side of bacon on their cabin doorstep. No note, no name. The next week, the mercantile owner, who had previously ignored them, gave May a curt, respectful nod as he passed them on the street. It was a silent, underground rebellion, a network of quiet decency asserting itself against the loud brutality of hatred. The stable was a ruin of charred timbers. Their home felt violated, unsafe, for days. Eloise was quiet, the trauma of the second fire leaving a new, invisible scar on her spirit. But as her hand began to heal, a slow, determined anger began to burn away the fear. She looked at her newly scarred left hand, the skin pink and puckered, and she saw not a mark of shame, but a badge of survival. She had faced the fire twice and had not been consumed. She would not be driven out. It was her idea. "They tried to burn us out," she said to May one morning, her voice imbued with a new strength. "They want us to disappear, so we will do the opposite. We will grow." She took the skills that were hers, the gifts May had recognized, and decided to share them. Using a few coins Agnes had pressed into her hand, she bought a small amount of flour and thread. She put up a notice, not in the center of town, but on a post near the well where the poorer women came to draw water. It announced a free class for any woman who wished to learn fine sewing, mending, and the art of baking bread. The first day, only 3 women showed up. They were the wives of struggling miners, women whose hands were rough and whose clothes were patched. They gathered awkwardly in the main room of the cabin, shy and uncertain, but Eloise, her own face a testament to imperfection, put them at ease. Her teaching was patient, her praise genuine. She showed them how to turn a simple flour and water dough into a light, airy loaf. She taught them an embroidery stitch that could turn a patched tear into a decorative flower. Word spread. The following week, 5 women came. The week after, 8. Soon, the cabin was too small. With the help of the blacksmith, whose wife was now Eloise's most devoted student, they cleared the charred debris of the stable and built a new, rough-hewn structure. It wasn't a stable anymore. It was a workshop. Twice a week, the air around the homestead filled with the scent of baking bread and the sound of women's voices, sharing stories, advice, and laughter. It was a community of the forgotten, a small circle of strength on the edge of a hostile town, and Eloise was its quiet, gentle center. One late afternoon, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, a young couple appeared at their gate. They were barely more than children. The boy, named Thomas, was a lanky farmhand who worked for one of the big ranchers, and the girl, Sarah, had the wide, frightened eyes of a bird. "Ma'am," Thomas said, twisting his hat in his hands as he addressed May, "We heard that this is a good place." "We're getting married," Sarah whispered, her hand finding Thomas's. "My folks, they don't approve of him. And Reverend Miller, he won't marry us without their blessing." "We want to get married," Thomas said, his voice gaining a sliver of confidence as he looked at Sarah. "Properly. But we don't want to do it in that church. Not after what they did to you. We were hoping," he faltered, looking at the ground. Sarah finished for him, her gaze direct and full of a simple, honest conviction. "We want to be married in a place where there's real love." She said, "Here." The request was so simple, so profound, it stole the air from May's lungs. She looked at the two young, hopeful faces, then turned her gaze to Eloise, who stood beside her, her face illuminated by the soft, golden light. She saw the quiet strength in Eloise's posture, the gentle wisdom in her eyes. She saw the community she had built from nothing but kindness and skill. She saw how this woman, who had been deemed worthless by the world, had created a sanctuary. A slow, wondrous smile spread across May's face. "You did this," she said to Eloise, her voice thick with an emotion that was part pride, part awe. "You taught them how to live again, how to hope." She reached out and took Eloise's good hand. "And you taught me, too." And so, they held a wedding. It was not in a church, but in the small yard in front of the cabin, under the vast, open sky. There was no organ music, only the sound of the wind and the quiet laughter of the women Eloise had taught. The decorations were not expensive silks, but strings of wildflowers the couple had picked themselves, tied with twine. Eloise, with her one good hand and the help of her students, baked a simple, beautiful wedding cake. May, standing tall and proud, officiated, using words not from a book, but from her own heart, speaking of loyalty, kindness, and the courage it takes to build a home together. As the young couple said their vows, their faces shining with a love that was pure and unashamed, the last of the sun's rays touched the small homestead, the little patch of land, which had been a place of lonely defiance and then a target of brutal hatred, had transformed once again. It was now a place of celebration, of community, of new beginnings. The small, defiant farm had finally, truly, begun to bloom. A year passed, a quiet turning of the seasons that worked its own kind of magic on the small homestead at the edge of Redemption Gulch. The raw, charred scar where the stable had once stood was now the foundation for a long, low workshop, its new timbers smelling of pine and industry. The vegetable garden had doubled in size, its neat rows a testament to a dozen helping hands. A new, larger chicken coop stood near the back, and the sound of hens clucking contentedly was a constant, gentle hum beneath the ever-present sigh of the wind. The homestead was no longer a place of defiant solitude. It had become a sanctuary. It was known simply as the homestead by those who needed it, a name whispered between women in desperate situations. It became a refuge for the flotsam of a harsh world. A young woman named Clara, widowed by a mine collapse and cast out by her husband's family who wanted her small plot of land, found her way there. She arrived with a hollow-eyed baby and a spirit worn thin as a thread, and Eloise took her in without a question. May, seeing the fear in the young woman's eyes, taught her how to handle a rifle, not as a weapon of aggression, but as a tool of confidence, a way to stand her own ground. Another girl, barely 16, named Beatrice, appeared one night with a bruised face and the haunted look of a runaway, fleeing a father whose affection was a cruel and twisted thing. Eloise gave her an apron and taught her the patient, healing alchemy of turning flour into bread. The homestead became a thriving ecosystem of women helping women. Eloise's bakery was now the heart of the operation. The small workshop housed a large, stone-built oven, and from dawn till midday, it produced the finest bread, pies, and cakes in the territory. Women from town, even some who had once turned their faces away in scorn, now discreetly sent their children with a few pennies to buy Eloise's wares. The bread was not just food. It was a quiet symbol of a different kind of power.
a quality and care that the bitter town could not replicate. May, in turn, had found a new purpose. The label of defiant widow had been worn away and replaced by that of a mentor. She taught the women who came seeking shelter how to ride, how to mend a broken fence post, how to read the weather in the clouds and the earth in their hands. She taught them self-reliance, the practical skills that would allow them to be beholden to no man. She and Eloise were the twin pillars of this new world they had built. Eloise was the heart, offering comfort, nourishment, and a gentle welcome. May was the spine, providing strength, structure, and the unshakable conviction that they all deserved to stand tall. The town of Redemption Gulch kept its distance. Caleb and his friends, though never formally accused, found themselves subtly ostracized by the very community they sought to dominate. Their brand of loud, violent hatred seemed to have soured in the light of the quiet, productive community growing at the edge of town. There were still whispers, still hard looks, but they were now fringed with a grudging, resentful respect. The homestead was an anomaly, but it was an undeniable success, and that was a truth the pragmatic town could not entirely ignore. The final scene of this chapter unfolded on a cool, clear evening in late autumn. A great, luminous harvest moon hung in the inky sky, bathing the prairie in a soft, ethereal silver. The air was crisp and smelled of wood smoke from the cabin's chimney and the sweet, dusty scent of the dying grasses. The sounds of the day had faded, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the low, mournful call of the wind as it swept down from the high ridges. Eloise and May sat together on the porch steps, a shared quilt wrapped around their shoulders. They had been sitting in a comfortable silence for a long time, watching the moonlight paint the rolling hills. Eloise's left hand, with its web of pale, silvery scars, rested in May's strong, calloused one. Their fingers were interlaced, a familiar, easy connection that needed no words. Eloise looked out at the land, at the home they had built not just from timber and stone, but from courage and kindness. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, the cruel rejection, the lonely desperation, the terror of the fire. She traced the new scars on her hand with the thumb of her other, a faint, puckered map of her survival. "You know," she said, her voice soft in the quiet night, "sometimes I think about that first fire, the one that took this." She gestured to the scarred side of her face, which was softened and made almost beautiful in the forgiving moonlight. "I spent so many years hating it, hating the girl I was for running back into that forge." She turned her head, her gaze meeting May's. Her good eyes shone with a profound, unshakable clarity. "But if I could go back to that very moment, I'd still choose the fire, because if it hadn't happened, I would have married William. I would have lived and died in that small town. Without the fire, I never would have found you." The words were a quiet testament, a rewriting of her own history, not as a tragedy, but as a painful, necessary prologue. May's grip on her hand tightened. A slow, gentle smile touched her lips, a smile that held all the love and wisdom of her years. She looked at Eloise, at the woman whose spirit had refused to be extinguished by flame or hatred, the woman who had taught her that her own heart was not a tomb for a dead husband, but a place where new things could grow. "We don't need anyone to choose us anymore, Eloise," May whispered, her voice a low, rough murmur that was carried away by the wind. "We chose each other." They fell silent again, but the silence was full. It held the truth of their shared past and the promise of their future. The wind howled across the vast, empty prairie, a lonely sound that spoke of the harshness of the world beyond their small patch of land. But here, on this porch, there was no isolation. There was the quiet strength of their clasped hands. There was the gentle warmth of the quilt. There was love. There was home. There was them. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Thank you for listening to this story from the Wild West Campfire. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We'd love to connect. Please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Campfire. and share your thoughts on Eloise and May's journey.